For more than a decade now, I've been trying different theories to answer the question of what happened to make the rising generation different from its predecessor. And I think I've settled on one of the bigger pictures of influence. If you go and I know you're not, some of you won't like this. If you go to the book of Judges in the Old Testament, you will read this. Let's see. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old, and also all that generation were gathered unto their fathers. And there arose another generation after them, which knew not the Lord, nor yet the works which he had done for Israel. And it's kind of an interesting thing that I hadn't really realized yet before. Joshua has always been depicted in the Sunday school lessons I had as a sort of younger man who had plenty of years left. Moses was old. Joshua and Caleb were the ones who were the only ones allowed who had left Egypt to enter the promised land. Now, the people who were with them heard the stories about how they left Egypt, and they were there for the conquest of Israel. So they knew all about the things that God had done, defeating Jericho without swinging a sword or shooting an arrow, and all the other battles that they had had and the things that they've been able to achieve in the way that the Lord had been there for them and protected them. So we have three different groups. The I left Egypt group and saw the miracles of the Lord. The I participated in the settling of the promised land group and saw the miracles of the Lord. And then when all of those people were dead, we had this third generation, which is described as a generation which knew not the Lord, nor yet the works which he had done for Israel. Okay, now there's two ways to take this. First, that they had no firsthand experience, because in their time, perhaps there were no miracles, but did they learn about it from their parents? Because I think this is the key here, is that much of Joshua's generation, or those who died around the time he was 110 years old, were not passing on to their children the things of their religion that made them a great people. Whether you're religious or not, religion is a way in which morality and virtue is couched into a society. The religious principles and tenets of a religion greatly influence the direction in which morality and virtue take among the people. So if in Joshua's generation, or those who died soon after him, as we read about in the book of Judges, the parents were not talking about the things that are parts of their dogma and their culture and their beliefs that would ensconce in them a good people, then a generation would rise up that, as we continue to read, did evil in the sight of the Lord and served Balaam. Now, Balaam is a literal idol, but Balaam is also sort of an imagery and modernity for worshiping anything other than virtue. So Balaam is typically excess, intemperance, and greed or vice in any degree. And so Balaam is appealing to the mind because it says, do whatever you want, and then if there's a God, then he'll beat you with a few stripes, and then you'll be saved. This is a nihilistic attitude that somehow got ensconced into this generation. I think that's what we're seeing today. We see, if you read the articles and the reports, that religion is on the downtrend and that people are no longer identifying as religious, or they call themselves spiritual but not religious, and they don't attach themselves to any particular faith. And the problem with that is not a membership problem. It's that if you detach yourself from identifying with a particular faith, then there's no standard by which to measure your morality and virtue, okay? Either for yourself or for other people who are watching you. So what it sets you up for is a buffet of sorts of character traits that happen to serve you in the moment. And you see that if you look at Gen Z, they seem to be a generation that wants to have it every way they want, only when they want it to be that way. The generation that says, I want to identify as male, if they're not. I want to identify as black, if they're not, or whatever the case may be, where they want it their way, regardless of the way other people might see it. Because there's no guideline, there's no fence posts, there's no There's no lines in the road to show this is the way in which they should walk. Because, I mean, it's different. You've driven, and sometimes people drift out of the lane, and sometimes Christians, Muslims, Jews will drift out of their lane. But if they have defined themselves or decided upon a set of principles, then it's much more easy to predict their behavior if you're in the lane next to them, and to have a civilization. Because I know if I have a Jew on one side and a Muslim on the other side, I can, if they are faithful to the tenets of their belief, then I can predict their behavior and adjust mine accordingly to stay safe in my lane for my life, even when their behavior appears to encroach upon my sovereign territory and my preferred state of affairs, because there's a predictability to their decision-making paradigm. And now we have Gen Z that doesn't attach themselves. They're not loyal at work. They're not reliable. They don't believe in fidelity. They flip from this to that. And they take every advantage to not be held accountable for anything by not identifying as something by which they can be measured. And so we have, I believe, a generation that raised them, which is partially, well, it's my generation if you look at Joshua, because they're looking like 100 years. So I don't have any children, but the children coming of age now are coming out of households where parents have not prioritized the things of a significant consequence. They're not teaching them about God or the works which he has done for Israel. And I see this in the congregation I attend at church, where there is a significant dearth of home-centered learning about the gospel, about the doctrine, about the tenets, about the scriptures, and they rely entirely upon the church to support something they're not even doing. And how do I know this? I taught Sunday school for the youth for 6 years, and now one of those kids, well, I think maybe one, had heard about Balaam, who saddled his ass. And we loved that story when I was growing up, because I could talk about how Balaam saddled his ass and Balaam smote upon his ass, and I wouldn't get my mouth washed out with soap because I was quoting scripture, which is from the same time. Balaam was the prophet who was hired by the indigenous peoples to curse the Israelites and Joshua's people as they were coming from Egypt into the land of Canaan. And it's an important story. It shows that if the prophet goes against God's will, God will kill his own prophet, because that prophet is no longer serving the master who has called him. So he'll remove him. And Balaam is saved by his ass, quite literally. I mean, the donkey ass, not by his derriere. But they don't know these stories. They don't know any stories. They don't know. They don't know many stories. They don't know context. They haven't learned about it. They're clearly not reading it, because when I ask them to read verses, they can't pronounce any of the words, which means they're not reading it as a family. No one's reading it to them. They're not reading it with their parents. They're not reading it out loud. They're probably not reading it at all, which means that the parents are not teaching the children the virtues, beliefs, values, and norms that contribute to a civil society. So they have raised up a generation which knows not the Lord or the works which he has done for Israel. That's what we've created here, which is sort of, well, that's to blame on both parties. It's the parents' fault and the children's fault. Like, I was a weird kid. When I was in high school, should have brought it with me. When I was in high school, I took a copy of the scriptures, ripped all the pages out, put a hole in the corner, and put it through a ring. And I would take 20 or 30 pages with me, and when I was bored in school, I would read it instead. And I made it through the scriptures twice, just my senior year of high school alone. This is not normal high school behavior, but it is something that I could do and that they could do too. And I've told them that story, hoping it would inspire them. I don't think it will, but they probably just think I'm weird. But the parents aren't doing it either. The kids don't do it and the parents don't do it. Who's going to do it? I have 90 minutes a month with them to teach them gospel principles in Sunday school. And that's assuming that they're on time, paying attention, and on task. And we all know they're carrying around these portals to distraction in their pockets at all times. And so they're grabbing that and they're looking at other things, even though they're allegedly looking at the scriptures on their phone. So home-centered learning for the gospel is important if you do not want to have this apostasy creep into your civilization. It will take down your civilization if it lasts for more than one generation. Fortunately for them, someone will come along and rescue them, but eventually it falls apart after Solomon, because Solomon sets a bad example, and then his sons are terrible. And it's probably because Solomon wasn't teaching them at home what they were supposed to do. And the scriptures are rife with these experiences. Eli's sons in the book of Samuel, who were not taught right by Eli, and they became wicked men, and so God removed Eli and his house from the carrying of the tabernacle and gave it to, what did I just say? Samuel. He's the one, Lord, thy servant heareth. Speak, Lord, thy servant heareth. So he was a good man. He was taught by his mother correctly. And so there's always somebody. But when it becomes a majority or a plurality of people who are not taught about the Lord or the works that he has done, where it's not been made a priority in the home, whatever the religion is, because this is the way in which most people get their values and their virtues taught to them, is in the context of a religious belief. And I believe it's one of the major reasons why we have so many immoral and unvirtuous people, is because they have stepped away from whatever religion in which they were raised, whatever religious identity to which they used to be attached, and they are now defining that whatsoever a man doeth is no crime. It's only natural. It's what I want. I don't want to be held accountable. You can't judge me. Only God can judge me. What, you mean the God you don't believe in and don't follow? Okay. Clever. It's convenient to use, but they don't follow him. And so I think that's what we're seeing, really. The big picture is a abandonment of virtue, because we have parents who have abandoned teaching virtue in the home. Does it have to be through religion? It doesn't. But if they're not doing it, they're not taking their kids to church, they're not making church a priority, they're not teaching them about the Lord and the works which he has done for their people, regardless of whether you're Israel or Islam or Christianity or whatever, Baha'i, if you're not ensconcing those things, they will have other virtues ensconced in them by the world. And the world, Balaam, will encourage them to values and virtues that are askew to civil society. And they will become industrious. They will do right things for wrong reasons and wrong things more often than not. Because it is a religion that excuses people based on their baser nature, that says, do whatever you like, except fat people, because everyone is beautiful. Unhealthy is not beautiful. Unhealthy is unhealthy, whether that's fat or skinny, because you can have unhealthy skinny too. It's rarer, but it's also possible. So we have here a shift in our civilization since the 1950s that has created the change from Currier and Ives to today, where the people are picking people based on being told what they want to hear. It's the same thing that Israel had when they left Egypt. Moses went up on the mountain to talk to God. The people were tired of waiting. They asked Aaron to build them a golden calf, and they worshipped a God that told them what they wanted to hear, because he wasn't a real God. And Balaam is not a real God. Balaam is not a real way of life. Balaam is not a virtuous way of life. And so there's an ever-increasing arch of people who are living unvirtuously, who are then demanding that the increasingly smaller portion do more to maintain the bailiwick of civil society and civilization. And eventually, not sure exactly where it is, this group will be so large that this group will not be able to compensate, and it will collapse. And because of the global world that they wanted to build, it will cause the entire world civilization to collapse to one degree or another. And they'll have this ripple effect across, because you can go anywhere you like and see the same thing. You can go to Prague, and you can tell, even though I don't speak Czech, that there's a increase in the secularistic focus of Christmas, in the traditional songs that are not religious songs. I cannot tell you how many times I heard people in very bad English singing live, "All I Want for Christmas is You." What the hell does that have to do with Christ? Oh, and all the Muslims who were at the market. I don't have any problem with them being there. I just didn't understand. You don't believe in Jesus. You just think he was some dude. who apparently was psychotic because he declared himself to be the Son of God, and you're totally okay with that part. Why were you there? I don't know. I don't get it. I'm sure there were plenty of other tourists who are not religious, or spiritual but not religious, who were there. They're harder to see by looking at them. But what we have is this push towards secularism, this push towards worldliness, this push towards nihilism, this push towards narcissism to do whatever you want and screw the other guy, sometimes quite literally. And but I can't do what I want because that's impeding on your rights. But your rights can impede on my rights, and that's not right. And so we have this redefining of virtue to be what I want when I want it to be that way, instead of having a standard. And it means that eventually there are no lanes. There are no lines in the road, and eventually everything crashes because nobody knows how to behave in order to safely arrive at their destination. Driving is about predictable behavior. Civilization requires us to be able to live with neighbors who have predictable behavior. And the more we abandon virtue and morality, whether you're religious or not, the more difficult it will be for us to maintain that civilization. We have today, at least Gen Z, but also probably millennials, a generation after them, after mine, which knows not the Lord, doesn't care to know the Lord, doesn't know anything about the things he has done, doesn't care to know anything about those things, which does evil and serves Balaam because Balaam tells them that it's okay to do what they want to do. And just because it is legal does not mean that it is moral. Just because people are doing it does not mean that it is right. But that is now the standard they are applying to measure their behavior. Oh, it's common, so it's okay. And you can't judge me because you're different, but I can judge you because you're not validating my worth. And eventually this portion will just go galt and it'll collapse. Or they'll get killed, or they'll fold, because that happens too. Go along to get along, go along to get ahead. And so I think that's what's actually happening at the under tier of anything else you could pick on. Like I've picked on social media, I've picked on cell phones, I've picked on the internet, but at the end of the day, it's virtue is not being taught in the home. Parents are not ensconcing virtue and morality in their children, and so we have a generation that's immoral, irreligious, and redefines virtue as whatever serves them. And that's going to undermine our civilization at one point. Anyway, those are my thoughts on that. If you don't like it because it was religious, write your own. Tell me what you think. Anyway, Godspeed, make good choices. Be the best person that you can be. You're not going to be perfect, but every good thing you do counts. Every worthy thing you do makes a positive difference, even if you never get to see it. Take care. Godspeed.